I'm Dan from ModPod, and I'd like to get you thinking about promoting your podcast, growing your audience, and advancing your goals. Not just after you've recorded your most recent episode, but throughout the entire production process. So before you record, while you're recording, and after you've published your new episode, I want you to think about incorporating podcast promotion so that it becomes second nature. If you create consistently good podcast content that has the ears of a loyal following, you've scored a major accomplishment for your company or brand. Your podcast audience is listening to you. Rarely does a business have the kind of relationship where their customers are willing to spend their precious time and offer their open minds. But with this power comes responsibility. Don't squander opportunities to advance your goals and create goodwill with your guests. Within each episode, ask yourself these 6 questions and incorporate your answers into the podcast. 1. Where can listeners send feedback? Want to prove your podcast is worth the listens and subscribes? During each episode, share and respond to some of the listener feedback that you've received. Don't have any listener feedback to share? Have you asked your listeners for their feedback? Have you encouraged their interaction? In every episode, take a moment to ask for their feedback. Provide them an email address, social media platforms, a blog that allows for comments, a phone number, or other ways to get in touch. The goal here: let your audience know this podcast is not a one-way street. You care about their impressions and about any new ideas they may have. If you give them this chance within every episode, you'll soon open doors for interaction, and you'll have new content for a short listener feedback segment. Plus, it makes podcasting much more interesting for you. 2. Where should new listeners go to subscribe? Fundamentally, your goal as a podcast producer is to entice new listeners to subscribe to your podcast, not just listen to one episode and quit. You want new listeners to subscribe to and listen to all your new episodes. In every episode, make it your job to find the time to speak directly to new listeners that are not yet subscribed. Know exactly where you'd like them to go to subscribe and describe exactly how they can do so. Make sure your podcast website caters to new listeners. Your RSS feed should be front and center, along with links to specific places where you want them to subscribe, like direct links to your podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. During each episode, direct new listeners to your podcast website so they can subscribe right away, even while they listen. 3. Should your guests receive extra value for appearing on your podcast? If your podcast is a guest format, you already know the value of promoting your podcast guests. In short, if you go out of your way to promote the guests you invite on your podcast and make it easy for them to promote their episode, they'll likely share their episode in their social circles. You may even score a coveted backlink. ModPod has a great video on exactly how to do this. It's called How to Promote Your Podcast Guests, and it's linked in the video description. 4. Where should you direct listeners that want to learn more about your brand or business? This is your podcast. You are entitled to spend a bit of time promoting what you do and asking your listeners to visit a website or other destination to learn more about your business or organization. Use your best judgment on how much time you allow for this within your episode, where in each episode to bring it up, and how often you might want to change up your pitch. 5. How exactly can your listeners help you grow your listenership? Every person you connect with is potentially an ally, with resources and goodwill to share. Draw on your host-listener connections and ask them to tell a friend about your podcast or share a favorite episode within their social media circles. If they decide to share on social media, ask them to tag your brand on Facebook, Twitter X, LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, or another platform. Most people find joy in sharing what they like, so your ask is an easy one. Having your podcast front and center in your listener circles is invaluable, so don't be afraid to ask. 6. Where would you like your listeners to write podcast reviews? Another way potential new listeners can find your podcast is via an amalgamation of glowing reviews written by any number of your current listeners. First, create great content. Then ask yourself where you'd like your listeners to review your work. For example, Apple Podcasts and Spotify. During each episode, give your listeners a short explanation as to why great reviews and ratings are important and helpful toward new listeners discovering the podcast. The higher a podcast rating, the more chances it will be seen in front of new eyes, and the greater the chance they'll subscribe. If 6 new segments seem like a lot to add to each episode, consider that each takes up a very small amount of time, especially after you've done it a few times. You'll learn to combine points and present them in different sequences, naturally weaving them into your main content. As you add these short segments while continuing to produce great content, you'll likely see increased listener interaction, social media shares, new reviews, new willing guests, more subscribers, increased traffic to your website, and hopefully even backlinks. Please comment or email us at info@gomodpod.com and tell us what other techniques work to grow your podcast. And visit us at gomodpod.com if you'd like assistance starting your own branded podcast.